She only meant to get away for 1 second. But the man she kissed was the one person in the room everyone feared. The words had not yet found their echo when Elena Hart stumbled backward through the glittering entrance of Bellissimo, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The restaurant was all low amber light, polished marble, and the soft clink of crystal glasses, but none of it could quiet the voice behind her. Her ex, Darren, calling her name with the ugly certainty of a man who believed she still belonged to him. Elena's fingers tightened around the strap of her small purse as she turned toward the crowd, searching for an exit, any exit, and found only a wall of evening gowns, tailored jackets, and curious eyes. Darren had followed her again, just like he had at the grocery store, just like he had outside her apartment, his smile sharp and possessive, his voice low enough to sound polite and cruel at the same time. "Come on, Elena," he said, stepping closer through the open dining room. "You're really going to make a scene over nothing?" A few people looked away. Others stared. Elena felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, that humiliating, helpless burn that came when someone louder tried to rewrite the truth in public. She had already said no. She had already asked him to leave. But Darren only smiled wider, as if her discomfort were some private joke he intended to enjoy. Then Elena saw the stranger. He stood near the back of the room in a charcoal suit so precise it looked carved onto him, one hand resting near the edge of a private booth, his expression unreadable beneath the warm gold light. He did not look like the others. He looked still, controlled, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Elena did not know his name. She only knew that when Darren took one more step toward her and reached for her arm, panic made the next choice for her. In one sudden breath, she crossed the distance, rose onto her toes, and kissed the stranger. It was not a careful kiss. It was not even a real one. It was a desperate, breathless, split-second decision made by a woman who needed the world to stop looking at her like she was weak. The room seemed to lose its air. Darren froze. The waiter passing by stopped mid-step. Somewhere, a glass set down too hard against a table. Elena pulled back at once, horrified by what she had done, her face burning so hot she thought she might disappear on the spot. And then she looked up. The stranger had not moved. His dark eyes were fixed on her with a quiet intensity that made her stomach drop, not from regret alone, but from something deeper she could not name. He did not look offended. He did not look amused. He looked like a man who had just been interrupted in the middle of deciding something important. The silence around them grew so complete it felt almost sacred. Darren's mouth opened, then shut again, his confidence suddenly thinner, his posture less certain. The stranger finally lowered his gaze to Elena, and when he spoke, his voice was calm enough to be terrifying. "Do you often use strangers to solve your problems?" Elena's breath caught. She should have apologized. She should have run. Instead, she stood there, trembling, while the man she had kissed studied her like he could read the truth behind every lie she had ever needed to tell. Elena did not move at first. The warmth of the stranger's hand was still on her cheek, and the entire room seemed to have stopped breathing with her. Darren stood near the doorway with his jaw tight and his smile gone, while the guests at Bellissimo stared into their glasses and plates, as if looking away could somehow make the moment disappear. The man she had kissed remained perfectly still, one hand resting against the edge of the table, his posture so calm it felt deliberate. Up close, he looked even more dangerous in his quietness, not because he raised his voice, but because he did not need to. Every detail about him seemed controlled, measured, expensive. The kind of man who did not enter a room unless the room belonged to him in some way. Elena swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how fast her heart was beating. She had meant to create a distraction, nothing more. One reckless second, one desperate mistake. But the air around this stranger had changed the shape of the entire night. Darren finally found his voice, though it came out strained and awkward. "Elena, what is this supposed to mean?" Elena flinched at the sound of her name in his mouth. He had used to say it like it gave him ownership. Now it only made her feel smaller. She forced herself to lift her chin. "It means I am done," she said, though her voice shook on the last word. A few people glanced up at that, and then away again. The stranger's eyes remained on her, unreadable and steady. Not judgmental, not kind, just observant, like he was taking in every fracture in her expression and storing them somewhere permanent. Darren laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Done?" You are standing here kissing another man in front of everyone. Elena, you think this makes you look strong?" She felt the old instinct to shrink, to apologize, to smooth over his anger the way she had done so many times before. But tonight something in her had already broken cleanly enough that it could not be bent back into place. Before she could answer, the stranger spoke, his tone low enough that it carried more weight than a shout. "She does not owe you an explanation." The sentence landed like a closed door. Darren turned toward him, his face hardening. "Excuse me." The stranger did not even look at him right away. His attention stayed on Elena, as if her fear, her embarrassment, and her silence mattered more than the man who had followed her in here. "If she wanted distance," he said, each word calm and precise, "then you should have given it to her before she needed to run." The table nearest them went quiet. Elena's breath caught again, not from relief exactly, but from the strange certainty that this man had seen too much in too little time. Darren's expression faltered, just for a second, and in that tiny crack she saw something new, not remorse, but caution. The stranger finally rose to his full height, and the whole room seemed to rearrange itself around him. Elena had not noticed before how the staff moved more carefully when they passed his table, how one of the managers had been hovering near the bar with a pale face and tense shoulders. Now it all made sense in a way that made her skin prickle. Darren seemed to understand it too. His eyes narrowed, then flicked to the watch on the stranger's wrist, the cut of his suit, the set of his shoulders. His confidence thinned into something ugly and uncertain. "Who are you?" he asked. The man looked at him at last, and when he answered, his voice was quiet enough to make the question feel foolish. "Someone you should have been more polite to." Elena should have been thinking about how to disappear. Instead, she found herself standing in the center of Bellissimo's polished floor, her pulse still racing from the impossible mistake that had just changed everything. The room around her had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel dangerous. Somewhere behind her, glasses were being set down with careful hands. Somewhere to her left, a woman inhaled sharply and then seemed to regret it. And in front of Elena, the stranger she had kissed remained calm enough to make everyone else look terrified. Darren was the first to break. His voice came out thinner now, stripped of the smug confidence he had worn only moments before. "This is ridiculous," he said, though even he did not sound convinced. He took one step forward, then stopped when the stranger lifted his eyes. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not need to be. The man at the table simply looked at him, and Darren's courage seemed to collapse under its own weight. Elena felt her throat tighten. She did not know this man. She did not know why the staff moved with such careful precision around him, why the managers seemed to avoid his table, why even the air around him felt heavier than it should. But she knew one thing now. This was not an ordinary stranger, and the mistake she had made had carried her into a place she no longer understood. The man finally turned his attention back to her, and when he did, Elena had the strange and unsettling feeling that he was not judging her at all. He was measuring her, not with cruelty, but with a kind of quiet attention that made her feel exposed in a completely different way. "You were trying to escape," he said softly. It was not a question. Elena swallowed hard. "Yes." Her answer came out smaller than she wanted. The word hung between them, fragile and honest. Darren gave a short laugh, but it sounded forced, brittle. "She is upset," he said quickly, as if he could still control the story if he spoke fast enough. "This is clearly a misunderstanding." The stranger did not look at him. That, more than anything, seemed to frighten Darren. Elena noticed the shift in his face, the way his eyes darted once toward the room, then away again, as though he were suddenly unsure whether he should stay or leave. The stranger's focus remained on Elena. "What was he to you?" he asked. Elena hesitated. The truth was ugly, and she had spent too long trying to make ugly things sound harmless. "Someone I thought I knew," she said. The answer landed harder than she expected. For a second, she saw something in the stranger's expression, something faint and shadowed, as if he recognized the shape of disappointment far too well. He extended a hand, not to touch her, only to offer balance in a room that had tilted under her feet. "Then you were right to leave." Those 6 words, spoken without pity and without judgment, nearly undid her. No one had said anything like that to her all night. Not once. Not when Darren tightened his grip on her arm at the entrance. Not when he spoke over her at the table, as if she were an inconvenience. Not when he smiled that polished smile and made every sentence sound like a favor. Elena felt the sting of embarrassment rise again, but now it was tangled with something else, something quieter and more dangerous. Relief. The stranger rose fully from his chair, and the movement changed the room again. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. Conversations elsewhere in the restaurant had stopped. Forks remained suspended over plates. Even the staff seemed to hold their breath. "Elena," Darren said sharply, hearing the shift and trying to recover his footing. "We are leaving. Now." He reached for her wrist, but Elena stepped back before his fingers could close around it. The motion was small. It did not need to be large. It was enough. Darren stared at her as though she had broken a rule he had assumed would always belong to him. For the first time that night, Elena did not shrink from his look. She looked past him, toward the man who had not raised his voice, not once, and yet somehow held the entire room in place. "I am not going anywhere with you," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not disappear. Darren's face tightened. He opened his mouth, perhaps to shame her, perhaps to command her, perhaps to remind her of every reason she had once believed she needed him. But before he could speak, the stranger set one hand lightly on the back of his chair and said, in the same calm tone that had silenced the room, "I think she made herself clear." And that was when Darren finally understood that whatever power he thought he had brought here, it was already gone. Elena did not realize she was still holding her breath until the stranger finally looked away from Darren and turned his attention back to her. The room remained frozen around them, every conversation suspended in the air like a held note that no one dared to release. Elena could feel the weight of those eyes on her, not cold, not cruel, but steady in a way that made it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. She waited for anger. She waited for embarrassment. She waited for the kind of dismissal she had been taught to expect from men like Darren. Instead, the stranger studied her with quiet patience, as if he understood that shame could linger long after the moment that caused it had passed. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was such a simple question that it nearly undid her. No one had asked it like that all evening. Not with curiosity, not with pressure, just concern, plain and unguarded. Elena swallowed hard and nodded once, though the movement felt fragile. "Yes," she said, even though her voice sounded thinner than she wanted. Behind her, Darren let out a small, bitter laugh, as if the idea of her being fine offended him. "This is absurd," he muttered, glancing around the table for support that no one gave him. "We are still in the middle of a conversation." The stranger did not look at him immediately. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Darren. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed level, almost quiet, and somehow that made it heavier. "No," he said. "You were in the middle of making her feel small." The words landed without force, without theater, yet the effect was immediate. One of the women at the table lowered her eyes. A man near the end of the room shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even the soft clink of glassware seemed to stop. Elena turned her face slightly, staring at the polished wood of the table so no one could see how close she was to crying. She hated that she still cared what Darren thought. She hated that the memory of his voice could still make her stomach tighten. He had spent months teaching her to doubt herself, to apologize for needing too much, for wanting too much, for speaking too softly and breathing too loudly, and existing in ways he found inconvenient. And now, standing under the glow of Bellissimo's golden lights, with strangers watching and her pulse still racing, she realized how exhausted she was from shrinking. Darren took a step forward again, but this time the stranger moved first. Not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to place himself between Elena and the man who had once made her feel trapped in a life she no longer wanted. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to anyone who had not been paying attention, but Elena saw it clearly. Protection did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrived as calm resolve. Darren's jaw tightened. "You do not know her," he said, trying to recover the edge that had begun to slip from his voice. "You do not know what she is capable of." The stranger's expression did not change. "Then perhaps," he said, "I have the advantage of meeting her as she actually is." Something in Elena's chest moved at that, something painful and warm at the same time. No one had spoken of her that way in a very long time. As Darren looked from one face to another and realized he no longer controlled the room, his confidence began to fall apart in plain sight. He tried one last time, lifting his chin with the kind of forced arrogance that had once made Elena obey. "Elena, come with me." She shook her head before he could finish. The answer felt clean. No, it was only one word, but it carried every month of silence, every swallowed insult, every moment she had spent hoping love would feel less like fear. The stranger glanced at her then, just once, as if to make sure she meant it. When she did not look away, something unreadable passed across his face, gone so quickly she almost missed it. Then he turned back toward Darren and said, "She said no." And in that quiet, unshakable voice, Darren lost the last of his certainty. Elena barely had time to steady her breathing before the room began to move again around her, not with ease, but with the careful hesitation of people who had just witnessed something they could not explain. Darren stood stiffly near the center of the lounge, his jaw tight, his face pale beneath the overhead lights, while the man beside Elena remained calm in a way that only made him seem more powerful. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. Even the soft clink of glassware from the bar sounded smaller now, as if the entire restaurant understood that one wrong word could shatter the fragile silence. Elena kept her hands folded in front of her to stop them from trembling. She did not know what she feared more, Darren losing control, or this stranger deciding she had made a terrible mistake by drawing him into her life for even a single breath. The man looked at her once, just once, and something in that glance told her he had noticed everything. The fear she had tried to hide, the way her shoulders had tightened when Darren spoke, the history she had spent months trying to bury beneath polite smiles. Then he turned toward Darren and said, with the same quiet control that had made the room go still in the first place, "You should leave her alone." Darren gave a short, humorless laugh, the kind men used when they were trying not to admit they had already lost. "And if I do not?" he asked, lifting his chin too quickly, too hard. The stranger did not answer right away. He simply adjusted the cuff of his suit, patient and composed, as though Darren were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption. When he finally spoke, his tone was almost gentle. "Then you will spend the rest of the evening regretting it." That was when one of the men near the back of the lounge stepped forward and leaned in close enough for Darren to hear the words that followed. Elena did not catch every detail, only enough to see Darren's expression change. The color drained from his face in a slow, visible wave. His confidence, so loud only moments ago, began to collapse in real time. "No," Darren muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "That cannot be." He looked at the stranger again, this time with a kind of nervous recognition that made Elena's stomach twist. The stranger did not speak his name, not yet. He did not have to. Whatever truth had just reached Darren was already enough. Elena watched Darren take one half step backward, then another, until the space between them finally felt safe for the first time that night. The stranger moved only after that, turning slightly toward Elena as if to ask without words whether she was all right. No one had ever made room for her like that before, not in a place like this, not after a mistake that should have humiliated her. Her throat tightened. She hated how close she was to crying, hated even more that it was not from shame anymore. "I did not mean to create trouble," she whispered. The man's eyes softened, but only for her. "You did not create anything," he said. "You defended yourself." The words landed in her chest with an odd force, as if someone had opened a window in a room she had kept sealed for years. Around them, the lounge remained frozen, every face turned in their direction, waiting for the next move. Darren swallowed hard, his voice smaller now than it had ever been when he was with Elena alone. "Elena, we need to talk." But before she could answer, the stranger took one quiet step closer, not threatening, only certain, and said, "Not tonight." It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried the weight of a final decision. Darren heard it too. His shoulders fell, and for the first time that evening, he had nothing left to say. The stranger then placed a steady hand near Elena's elbow, careful, respectful, asking without words if he could lead her away. She hesitated only a second before nodding, because the truth was simple now. For the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of walking away. And as she let him guide her through the stunned silence of Bellissimo Lounge, she did not notice the way every eye followed them, or the way Darren stared after them like a man realizing too late that the power he had relied on was never really his to begin with. Before Elena could fully understand what had just happened at Bellissimo Lounge, the room had already changed around her. The same people who had been whispering only minutes ago now watched in uneasy silence, their attention moving between her and the stranger beside her, as if they had all stepped too close to something they did not know how to name. Darren remained near the center of the lounge, his posture rigid, his face drawn tight beneath the warm lights that now seemed to do him no favors at all. He had come into the evening expecting to control the room, to control her, to control the story. Instead, he looked like a man waiting for permission to leave a place he no longer owned. Elena kept her eyes forward, but her pulse had not settled. She could still feel the strange weight of that kiss, not in a romantic way, not in any way she would have ever chosen, but as the kind of reckless moment that splits a life into before and after. The stranger, by contrast, seemed almost unervingly calm. He did not glance at Darren with anger. He did not need to. His silence carried more authority than any raised voice could have managed, and that made everything around him feel smaller by comparison. Elena noticed the details she had been too shaken to see before. The expensive watch resting against his wrist. The measured way the lounge staff avoided standing too close. The subtle change in the atmosphere whenever he shifted his attention, as if the entire room had learned to listen without being told. When Darren finally tried again, his voice came out thinner than before. He took one step toward Elena, then stopped when the stranger simply turned his head in that direction. It was not a warning. It was worse than that. It was certainty. Darren forced a smile that did not hold. "Elena, we should talk somewhere private," he said, trying to recover the power he had already lost. But the stranger answered before she could. "She does not need to go anywhere with you." The words were quiet, almost polite, and yet they landed with such finality that even the nearby tables seemed to hold still. Elena looked up at him then, truly looked, and something in her expression must have changed, because for the first time his composure softened just enough to become something human. Not gentle, not weak, just briefly, unmistakably aware of her. Darren heard the refusal and stared at them both, his jaw tightening as he realized the room was no longer standing with him. Even the people who had once seemed eager for his approval now looked away. The stranger placed a steady hand near Elena's elbow, not touching her forcefully, only offering direction. She hesitated, then let him guide her toward the side corridor where the light grew dimmer and the noise from the lounge faded into a low, distant murmur. Once they were out of the center of the room, Elena finally found her voice. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her tone low because something in her already knew that speaking too loudly would make this feel even more unreal. He looked at her for a long second before answering. Someone who does not enjoy watching women be cornered. It should have sounded like a simple line. Instead, it felt like a confession. Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of the night, but the sound never came. Behind them, she could still sense Darren standing there, stripped of his confidence and left with nothing but the humiliating fact that she was no longer looking his way. The stranger opened a door at the end of the corridor and let her step through first into a quieter private room lined with dark wood and soft amber light. For the first time since the evening began, Elena was not surrounded by noise and judgment. She was surrounded by stillness. And in that stillness, she realized something that made her chest tighten all over again. This man had not stepped in by accident. He had been watching from the beginning. Before Elena could make sense of the private room, the stranger had already closed the door behind them with a soft, final click that seemed to cut the rest of Bellissimo off at the frame. The noise from the lounge disappeared at once, replaced by the low hum of hidden air vents and the faint ticking of an expensive wall clock. Elena stood just inside the room, her hands still tense at her sides, trying to slow the race of her breathing. The man did not move closer. He simply watched her with a steady patience that felt more unsettling than pressure. Up close, he seemed even more impossible than he had under the lights outside. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, his calm so complete it almost looked unnatural. Elena had spent enough time around men who liked to be seen. This was different. He looked like someone who had nothing to prove and no reason to raise his voice. "You are safe in here," he said at last, his tone quiet and controlled. Elena almost asked why she should believe him, but the words stopped at the edge of her mouth. Because what she saw in his face was not hunger, not curiosity, and not the cheap confidence Darren had carried like a costume. It was something colder, more disciplined, and far more dangerous in its restraint. He reached to the side table, picked up a glass of water, and set it down within her reach without touching her hand. That small act should have eased her. Instead, it made her even more aware of how carefully everything about him seemed chosen. "You did not have to bring me in here," she said, trying to find her footing again. "No," he replied, "but I wanted to give you 1 minute where no one could speak over you." The words settled into the room and stayed there. Elena looked away first, then hated herself for it. She had told herself all night that she only needed to survive one awkward conversation, one humiliating moment, one clean escape from a man who had stopped seeing her as a person somewhere along the way. Yet now, in this quiet room, it felt as if the night had turned and was watching her back. The stranger crossed the room and opened a side panel where a small bar was hidden behind dark wood. He poured himself nothing. Instead, he leaned one hand against the counter and studied her with a look that was almost thoughtful. "He knew you would be here tonight," he said. Elena frowned. "Darren." "Yes." Her throat tightened. "How did you know that?" The man did not answer immediately. Outside the room, a muffled burst of laughter from the lounge drifted through the walls and faded again. Then he said, "Because men like him rarely surprise anyone. They only repeat themselves." Elena should have felt relief at hearing someone else say what she had been too ashamed to admit. Instead, a strange ache rose behind her ribs. She thought of the way Darren had smiled while cornering her, the way he had spoken as if her discomfort was a misunderstanding she owed him. The memory made her arms go cold. The stranger saw the change in her expression, and his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, as if he had already decided something. "He will not bother you again tonight," he said. It was not a promise made for comfort. It sounded like a fact. Elena searched his face, trying to understand who he was and why the entire room outside had gone so careful when he stepped in. "Who are you?" she asked again, quieter this time. He held her gaze for a long beat before answering. "Someone your ex should have recognized before he made a mistake." The line sent a thin line of unease through her, but also something else she was not ready to name. For the first time in hours, she was no longer thinking about how to escape. She was thinking about why this man felt less like a stranger every second she looked at him. Elena did not speak at first, because the silence in the private room felt heavier than anything Darren had ever said to her. The stranger remained where he was, one hand resting lightly near the edge of the table, his posture calm in a way that made the whole room seem smaller. The city lights beyond the glass cast a muted glow across his face, sharpening the angles of his cheekbones and catching the steady gray of his eyes. He was not trying to comfort her. He was giving her space to breathe. That, more than anything, unsettled her. For the first time that night, no one was crowding her, no one was smiling too hard, and no one was pretending that her discomfort was a joke. She slowly lowered the hand that had been clenched at her side and realized it was trembling. "You do not have to keep looking over your shoulder," he said at last, his voice low and even. "Not here." Elena swallowed, trying to understand why those words felt so different from every promise Darren had ever made. He had always spoken like a man asking for patience. This man spoke like a man who expected order. Outside the room, she could still hear the dull, distant pulse of the lounge, but it no longer reached her the same way. Inside, there was only the faint tick of the clock and the quiet certainty in his voice. She looked down at the glass in front of her, untouched, then back up at him. "You knew him," she said. It was not really a question. He did not answer right away. His gaze moved to the door, then back to her, as if measuring how much truth she could hold in one moment. "I know men like him," he said finally. "Men who confuse persistence with entitlement." The words were calm, but they landed with the weight of something personal. Elena felt her throat tighten. She had spent months shrinking around Darren, learning how to make herself smaller so arguments would end faster. Now, in a room she had entered by accident and fear, she was being seen with a clarity that almost hurt. The stranger noticed the change in her face, and his expression softened by a fraction, just enough to reveal that he was paying attention to every breath she took. "Did he hurt you?" he asked. The question was direct, but not sharp. Elena shook her head once, then stopped, because honesty felt more complicated than that. "Not the way you mean," she said. "He just never heard me." Something shifted behind the stranger's eyes at that. A silence stretched between them, deep and exact, and Elena had the strange feeling that he understood far more than she had meant to say. He turned slightly, looking toward the dark window, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed. That is often how the worst men operate. They do not need to raise their voices if they have already convinced everyone else to stay quiet. Elena stared at him. The sentence was too precise, too measured, to belong to someone merely passing through a lounge like Bellissimo. She opened her mouth, then closed it again as footsteps sounded outside the door. For one brief moment, the stranger's entire posture changed. Not tense, not fearful, just alert. Elena followed his gaze to the door, and when it opened, the man standing in the frame did not look like a host or a waiter or anyone who answered to the room they were in. He looked startled first, then immediately careful, as if he had entered a place where the rules had changed without warning. "Mr. Bianchi," he said quietly, with the kind of respect people used when they wanted to survive a conversation. Elena blinked, because the name meant nothing to her. But the way the room reacted to it did. The stranger did not turn fully toward the newcomer. He only set down his glass with deliberate slowness and said, "Cancel the rest of my evening." The request was so calm that it almost sounded like a decision already made. The man in the doorway nodded at once and disappeared, closing the door with even more care than he had used to open it. Elena stood frozen. "Bianchi," she repeated under her breath, and this time she saw the smallest change in his expression. Not surprise, recognition that she had started to understand. "You should not be here alone," he said. Elena gave a short, breathless laugh that held no humor. "I was not exactly invited into this part of the night." He looked at her for a long second, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim black card, setting it on the table between them. "If he finds you again," he said, "you call this number first." She stared at the card without touching it. "Why would you help me?" The question came out softer than she intended. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable, and for a moment the dangerous quiet around him seemed to sharpen even more. "Because," he said, "you have already spent too long with a man who taught you to accept being ignored." Elena's breath caught, and before she could answer, the door opened again, this time with more urgency than before. Several voices crowded the hall outside, lower and tense, and the stranger's attention moved past her in a single controlled motion. Whatever had been coming for him, or for her, had arrived sooner than either of them expected. He looked at Elena once more, then stepped closer at last, not enough to frighten her, but enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence cut cleanly through the rising noise beyond the door. "Stay where you are," he said. And somehow, even before she understood why, Elena obeyed. By the time Elena understood that the room outside had quieted, the silence inside the private suite had become its own kind of shelter. Rafael stood near the window with one hand resting at his side, composed as ever, but the tension in his shoulders had not fully disappeared. He had spent the last several minutes making sure the staff kept their distance, making sure Darren could not force his way back in, and making sure Elena had a moment to breathe without feeling hunted. She sat on the edge of the velvet chair, fingers still curled tightly around the edge of her coat, trying to convince herself that the worst was over. But Rafael had already noticed what she could not hide. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands were cold, and the fear she had carried into the lounge had not vanished just because the door was closed. He turned slightly, his voice low and steady. "You are safe here." The words were simple, but they landed with a force Elena did not expect. For a moment, she did not answer. Outside the tinted glass, city lights shimmered over the dark skyline of Manhattan, and the private room felt suspended above the noise of the world below. Elena looked down at her hands, then forced herself to speak. "I am not used to that," she said quietly. Rafael watched her with a stillness that felt almost heavier than movement. "I know," he replied. She gave a bitter little breath, not quite a laugh, and looked away. "You do not know anything about me." That should have ended the conversation. Instead, Rafael crossed the room with unhurried control and stopped only when he was close enough for her to feel the quiet gravity of him without being overwhelmed by it. "I know enough," he said. "I know that you apologized for someone else's cruelty. I know that you have been carrying fear for far too long. And I know that men like Darren depend on silence." Elena lifted her eyes to his, startled by the precision of his words. No one had ever spoken about her pain so directly, and certainly no one had done so without expecting something in return. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice thinner now, almost vulnerable enough to break. Rafael did not answer right away. For the first time, his expression shifted in a way that made him seem less untouchable and more human, though only for a second. "Because," he said at last, "someone should have cared sooner." The room seemed to go still around that sentence. Elena felt it settle somewhere deep in her chest, where all the ignored apologies and swallowed tears had been stored for years. Then Rafael reached toward the table and picked up the folded jacket he had placed there earlier. He did not put it on her himself. He only held it out, giving her the choice. "Take this," he said. "If you want to leave tonight, I will have someone drive you home. If you want to stay until you feel ready, then stay. No one will force you out of this room." Elena stared at the jacket, then at him. There was something about the way he offered her an option instead of an order that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt larger than anything Darren had ever given her. Across the hall, faint footsteps passed and faded again, but no one entered. No one interrupted. For once, the world seemed to wait for her answer. Elena rose slowly, still uncertain, still frightened, but no longer invisible. She took the jacket from his hand, and their fingers brushed for a brief instant that seemed to stop the air between them. Rafael did not move. He only looked at her with that same unreadable calm, as if he already knew the choice she was about to make. And when Elena finally drew the jacket around her shoulders, she realized the evening had changed in a way she had never imagined. The man she had kissed by accident was not leaving her to face the aftermath alone. He was still there, steady as stone, standing between her and the life that had tried to shrink her. She had come to the lounge hoping only to escape humiliation. Instead, she had found the one person powerful enough to stop it and kind enough not to make her beg. Then Rafael's phone vibrated once against the table, and the faint sound pulled both of them back into the present. He glanced down at the screen, and something unreadable crossed his face. The calm in the room shifted at once, subtle but undeniable. Elena noticed it immediately. Whatever message he had just received, it had changed the air around them. Rafael looked up again, his gaze fixed on her for one brief, exacting moment. "It seems," he said quietly, "this night is not finished with us yet."